The boy realizes his mother missing for 30 years after a sudden brake of the car. Frank was driving home after a tiring day at work. He glanced at the rearview mirror, then suddenly turned back when a woman darted out right into the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes hard. The car swerved for an instant, almost hitting her. At that moment, he still couldn't see the woman clearly, only noticing her standing frozen in the middle of the street, her trembling hand waving as if to apologize. But what made him stop, what made his heart feel like it stopped beating, was when the headlights illuminated her face. Frank gasped for breath. A cold sensation ran down his spine. That woman looked exactly like his mother. The image from an old photo of his mother flashed vividly in his mind. It was unbelievable. His mother had been missing for 30 years, how could this be happening? He choked up, unable to understand what was going on. His mother, could it really be her? She had disappeared from his life all those years ago, but now, her figure was standing right before his eyes, in a state of confusion and tattered misery. He stepped out of the car, his heart full of bewilderment and worry. The woman was still standing there, her eyes empty, her hands trembling. She stammered, her voice weak as if about to break. "Don't take me, don't lock me up again." Frank stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she had just said. "Lock me up again." He repeated those words in his head, his mind spinning. What had happened to his mother? She seemed frightened and anxious, like an animal being hunted. Frank couldn't accept that this woman might be his mother. His mother couldn't have turned into a homeless person, abused to the point of becoming such a pitiful shadow of herself. A surge of anger rose within Frank, fierce as a storm. What happened to my mother, he thought to himself. Why had she become a homeless person, living in such isolation and suffering? Painful memories of a childhood without his mother, abandoned by his father, and the long nights tormented by the trauma of her disappearance came flooding back. He felt as if the whole world was collapsing beneath his feet. Could she be my mother? Frank asked himself, a painful question he didn't dare believe had an answer. He stared at the woman's face, the resemblance undeniable. Confusion and fear weighed heavily on him. "No way," he whispered, but deep down he knew something was terribly wrong here. He helped the woman into the car, feeling like he was taking an action he couldn't explain. As the car started moving, Frank's mind was full of worry and confusion. He didn't know what to do, but he decided to take her to the hospital, where he hoped he could find some answers. After bringing the woman to the hospital, Frank felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. His heart was pounding, his hands trembling as he walked into the emergency room. His whole body was tense like a tightly wound string. He just wanted to know the truth, to understand why this woman looked so much like his mother, and why she had been left in such a terrible state. Questions kept coming to his mind, making it impossible for him to think clearly. The nurse in charge of the emergency room was a middle-aged woman, with a calm appearance, but her eyes showed clear surprise when she saw the homeless woman Frank had brought in. The woman rested her head on his shoulder, saying nothing, just trembling slightly. "How is she?" Frank asked urgently. The nurse frowned, looking at the woman for a long time before answering. "She seems exhausted, showing signs of long-term starvation. We need to run some health checks immediately." She called the doctor, and a few minutes later, the doctor came in to examine the woman. Frank sat waiting in the emergency room, every second feeling like a century. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. His mother had gone missing 30 years ago, yet this woman had the same figure and face as her. How could there be such a strange coincidence? It couldn't just be a coincidence. But if she was his mother, what had happened to her during all that time? Why hadn't she contacted him? Why had she been locked up in a mental institution for 30 years? The doctor returned after completing the preliminary examinations. "We've done some basic tests. Her condition is very serious, severe malnutrition, extreme physical exhaustion, and signs of long-term abuse," the doctor said. "I think we need to run a DNA test to officially confirm her identity." Frank felt dizzy. Although part of him had hoped this was all just a misunderstanding, the more he heard from the doctor, the deeper the pain in his heart grew. He wanted to be sure he wasn't caught up in some incomprehensible situation, and to ease his doubts, he decided to go through with the DNA test. The next day, the DNA test results arrived. When he got the call from the doctor, Frank felt like he couldn't breathe. The DNA test has confirmed it. She is Julia, your mother, the doctor said, his voice serious. Frank couldn't believe his ears. Why was she here, in such a terrible condition? For the past 30 years, he had lived with the pain of losing his mother, never knowing that she had been so close, locked away in a mental hospital. Frank's emotions at that moment were beyond words. He felt anger, deep pain, and a profound sadness in his heart. Another nurse, someone who had worked at the hospital for a long time, suddenly remembered Julia. I remember her, the nurse said. She used to be a patient at the psychiatric nursing home, but that hospital was shut down 10 years ago. The nurse shook her head slightly. It's unclear how she ended up here, but what we do know is that she spent years being abused. The feeling of rage inside Frank burst forth. Why had his father done that to his mother? Why had he sent her to a mental hospital and left her to suffer for 30 years without ever telling Frank? These questions spun endlessly in Frank's mind, making him feel as if he were standing in the middle of a devastating storm. He decided to find answers. Even if he had to face painful emotions, he had to know the truth. How was she kept there all those years? He asked the doctor. The doctor looked at Frank with sympathetic eyes. We will do everything we can to help her recover, but psychological treatment will take a long time, he said. Then he gestured for Frank to follow him into another room to continue monitoring Julia's condition. In those moments, Frank sat in the hospital room, unable to stop thinking about everything that had happened over the past 30 years. He couldn't forget the image of that woman, his mother, left in darkness, living in shame, hunger, and abuse. It only made him angrier and more heartbroken. Frank felt tense as he sat in the hospital office. Although the doctor had told him his mother's health was slowly improving, questions kept swirling in his mind. He looked at an old photograph of Julia, the woman he had lost for so many years, now appearing again in a state so terrible it was unimaginable. Why had his mother had to live such a life? Why had his father treated her that way? He was determined to uncover the truth. Everything he had heard about the hospital, about his mother being committed 30 years ago, it all made him feel deceived and devastated. Now, he needed to know everything. Without wasting any more time, Frank began searching for old hospital records, documents that could explain the mysterious disappearance of his mother. He went to the psychiatric hospital where she had once been held and demanded detailed information about her records. It wasn't easy, but after an intense exchange, he finally obtained the crucial documents. As he opened the files, Frank couldn't believe his eyes. There it was, an old document with his father's signature, Richard, authorizing Julia's admission to the psychiatric nursing home 30 years ago. It felt like a hard slap across his face. His mother hadn't gone there voluntarily. She had been committed by his father, forced to live in that place for all those years. Chaotic emotions consumed Frank's mind. His mother had never abandoned him, had never wanted to leave their family. It was his father who had taken away her freedom. This truth hit him like a shock, a wound in his heart that he couldn't accept. Memories of Frank's childhood flooded back. He remembered the years living with his father but without his mother. The times he asked about her and only received lies from his father. The times he felt alone, abandoned by the man he had once admired and loved. Now, with the truth revealed, everything became clear. His father was the one who had caused this horrific pain to their family. Anger surged inside Frank. He stood up, clutching the documents tightly in his hands, unable to bear the feeling of betrayal. His father had lied to him all those years. Frank could never forgive him. Determined to confront his father, Frank didn't hesitate to return to the family estate. He was ready to face Richard. His mind was tense, and his emotions burning with fury. He couldn't wait any longer. As he stepped into the mansion, the atmosphere inside felt heavy, as if nothing in this family was whole anymore. Frank found his father sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened. Richard looked up, his eyes cold, showing no surprise at all upon seeing Frank. "Dad, what did you do to Mom?" Frank asked, his voice filled with rage. Richard didn't change his expression. He put the newspaper down, took a long breath, and answered calmly. "She was weak. She didn't deserve to be my wife." His voice was cold, as if nothing about this was important. Those words felt like a dagger stabbing into Frank's heart. "What did she ever do wrong, Dad? Why did you treat her like that?" Richard looked at his son and sneered. "I needed a strong wife, someone who could help me advance in my career. She was too weak. She couldn't meet my demands." That cruel answer hit Frank like a powerful blow. He couldn't believe what his father had just said. So it was true, his father had committed his mother to a mental institution simply because she didn't fit into his ambitions. Frank felt like he was about to lose control. He moved closer to his father, his hands clenched tightly into fists. He wanted to lunge at him, to unleash all the anger he had bottled up for so long. But he also knew that doing so wouldn't change anything. He took a deep breath, struggling to hold back the fury burning inside him. "You're no longer the man I once admired," Frank said, his voice firm, no longer holding any softness. "I won't let you get away with this." Frank turned around and walked out. His heart pounded violently, his chest felt like it was being crushed by a massive weight. He had been deceived his entire life, and now, what was he supposed to do to face this terrible truth? But one thing was certain, his father would have to pay for what he had done. Frank couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation with his father. The anger and fury were still surging inside him, making him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. His father's words echoed in his mind like a knife stabbing into his heart, and he couldn't accept the cruelty Richard had inflicted on his mother. The next day, Frank decided this couldn't end here. He knew he had to do something to bring the truth to light, to get justice for his mother. He began researching the legal steps needed to file a lawsuit against his father. The tension and fear were still there, but he had no other choice. He contacted a skilled lawyer, someone who had handled many complex cases. The lawyer, whose name was Alexander, listened to Frank's story and immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. "If you have enough evidence, we can reopen the case and bring your father to justice," Alexander said. "We'll need the hospital documents, as well as testimonies from witnesses, to prove that your mother's confinement was illegal." Frank couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened, but he also felt a faint glimmer of hope. Finally, he could do something, not just to uncover the truth but to give his mother back a peaceful, free life. A few days later, Frank and Alexander had gathered enough evidence to reopen the case. The hospital documents, his mother's medical records, and the testimony of a nurse who had worked at the psychiatric institution all exposed the truth. The nurse confirmed that Richard, Frank's father, was the one who had signed the order to commit Julia to the mental institution, citing reasons like protecting the family and ensuring his career. This truth only made Frank angrier because he had not only lost his mother but also had to face the ruthless lies of the man he once admired. The press quickly picked up the story. Prominent businessman Richard, accused of locking his wife in a mental institution for 30 years, blared the headlines on the front pages of newspapers. The public was outraged, and the intense media attention only made the situation more tense. Those who had once admired Richard now began to see him in a different light. The reputation he had built over the years started to crumble. Frank noticed a clear change in how people perceived his father. Richard's old friends began to distance themselves from him. No one stood by his side anymore. Harsh criticism from the media and public outrage forced Richard to face a crisis bigger than anything he had ever experienced. However, he remained indifferent, showing no sign of remorse. Meanwhile, Frank felt like he was walking a long and difficult path, but it was the right path, one that led to the truth. The police began their investigation. They interviewed those who had worked at the psychiatric institution, including the nurse who had testified. Each testimony and document proved that Julia had not been mentally ill but was instead unlawfully detained. The case became even more serious. This gave Frank a small sense of relief. He knew his father wouldn't be able to escape responsibility for what he had done. One morning, while Frank was working at his office, he received a call from Alexander. "We have good news," Alexander said. "The police have issued an arrest warrant for Richard. He will be prosecuted for unlawful deprivation of liberty." Frank felt like a fresh breath of air had filled his mind. Finally, his father would pay for what he had done. He didn't feel joy, and there was no satisfaction in his heart, but at least he had done something for his mother. Her life would never be the same as it was before, but at least she would know that the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. On the day of the trial, Frank stood in the courtroom, facing the father he had once loved and admired. Richard still wore the same cold expression, showing no emotion as the court announced the charges he was responsible for. "I only did what was best for the family." Richard's defense echoed through the courtroom. But no one believed those words. The public refused to accept his justification. The entire courtroom fell silent as they listened to the irrefutable evidence. Frank sat still, no longer feeling angry. The fury had subsided, replaced by a sense of relief, as if a great burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. His mother would be free, and justice had finally been served. After the trial, Frank felt as though he had just come through a storm. The chaotic emotions still clung to him, refusing to let go. The court had sentenced his father, but that couldn't erase the pain he had endured all those years. His mother, Julia, would never be the strong woman she once was, but at least she wouldn't have to live in confinement anymore. He couldn't stop thinking about the suffering she had endured over the past 30 years. But now, his mother had come back. After all those years, he could finally take care of her, help her return to a normal life. Frank decided to rent a small, warm apartment where his mother could live peacefully for the rest of her days. He didn't want her life to be filled with torment anymore. He wanted to create a space where his mother could feel safe and loved. When they first stepped into the new apartment, Julia looked around in confusion. She had spent too long within the cold walls of a mental institution, and now this warm, cozy place seemed unfamiliar to her. Frank carefully led her to the living room, where the soft glow from the lamps created a calming space. "You'll stay here now, Mom. You don't have to be afraid anymore," Frank said gently, his eyes filled with concern and tenderness. Julia looked at her son and slowly sat down on the couch. A tear rolled down her cheek. Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice trembling with worry and fear. She still couldn't recognize everything around her, but her eyes reflected exhaustion, as if she had been forgotten for a long, long time. Frank sat beside his mother, taking her hand gently in his own. "I'm Frank, your son. I'll never leave you behind again," he said, his heart breaking. He felt as though his world was falling apart, seeing his mother in such a state. Memories of his childhood, of those years growing up without her, came crashing over him like a violent wave. He remembered the long nights when he was alone, asking where his mother had gone, questions no one would answer. A few days later, Julia gradually stabilized her health. Though the wounds in her soul were still there, she began to recognize her son, to realize that her life had changed. One bright morning, she sat by the window, looking out and sighing. "You've grown up so strong, my son," she said, her voice full of pride and love. "And so have you, Mom. You're the strongest woman I've ever known," Frank replied, his eyes filled with tears. He felt a change deep within himself, sensing that their lives might finally return to peace. One afternoon, Frank and his mother walked together in the park. The warm spring sunlight bathed them as they strolled side by side, and everything around them seemed fresher than ever. Julia held tightly to Frank's hand, as if afraid that she might lose the people she loved all over again. I feel more at peace now," she whispered. Frank looked at his mother, his heart full of joy and hope. They had made it through the darkest days, and now they could begin again. However, Frank could never forget what had happened in the past. He had witnessed his father's cruelty, and even though justice had been served, he still couldn't erase the feeling of betrayal. But what he could do now was help his mother find happiness again, help her live a new life, one without fear or pain. Frank and Julia began rebuilding their lives. Each passing day brought them closer, sharing moments of joy and peace that they had never experienced before. Frank gradually realized that life wasn't only about suffering, there could also be happiness. He no longer felt imprisoned by the past. He had learned how to forgive, how to love. One day, as they sat together in the garden, Julia turned to Frank, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, for bringing me home. I don't feel lonely anymore," she said. Frank looked at his mother, his eyes brimming with tears. "You'll never be alone again, Mom. I'll always be here with you," he said, his voice warm and full of emotion. Their life wasn't perfect, but at least they had each other. And that was the most important thing. Finally, Frank felt that justice had been done, and a new life had begun for both of them. At last, mother and son had found happiness, despite the challenges they had faced. And together, they would walk the new path ahead, no more darkness, no more pain. Frank and Julia's life gradually settled after the storms of the past. Each passing day brought them closer together as they built new routines and found peaceful moments they had never known before. Frank felt as if he were living in a dream after so many years of pain. He remembered the long, lonely nights when he had no idea where his mother was, what she was doing, or even if she was still alive. And now, seeing his mother growing healthier each day, his heart was filled with gratitude and happiness. One beautiful morning, Frank decided to take his mother to a place he had always wanted to bring her, a park near the neighborhood where they lived. The surroundings were peaceful, with lush green trees and blooming flowers creating a wonderfully relaxing atmosphere. Julia hadn't completely escaped the haunting memories of the past, but she had slowly begun to find peace in moments like these. "How do you feel, Mom?" Frank asked as they walked along a small path in the park. Julia gave a gentle smile and squeezed his hand tightly. "I feel like I've found something I lost. It's like I'm alive again," she said softly. Then she turned to look at Frank, her eyes shining with a new hope she had never had before. "You've made me feel alive again," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Frank could sense the change in his mother. The wounds in her soul were still there, but at least she no longer lived in fear, no longer worried about what would happen next. He couldn't erase the painful memories she had endured, but he could help her rebuild this life, a life she deserved. They sat down on a bench in the park, surrounded by quietness, with only the sound of birds singing and the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. Frank looked at his mother, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He knew he would never let her suffer loneliness and pain again. He would always be her solid support, no matter what. "Do you regret the years that have passed?" Frank asked, his voice lowering into something quieter, more somber. Julia was silent for a moment, as if pondering his question. At last, she replied. "No, my son. I don't regret them. I only regret not having you by my side during all those years. But now, with you here, I feel like everything happened for a reason." She looked up at the sky, as if searching for something far away, but then her gaze returned to Frank, and she smiled. "I'm happy to be with you. Happy that I've finally found my son again." Frank felt his heart tighten at her words. He looked into her eyes, where both pain and hope dwelled. "I won't let you leave me again. You'll never have to live in loneliness like before," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. From that day on, Frank and his mother's life gradually became more stable. Julia started participating in community activities, meeting new friends, and little by little, she rediscovered joy in her life. Frank, with endless patience and boundless love, helped her overcome the pain, showing her that there was still so much good in this world to experience. Although the truth about his father still haunted Frank's heart, he had learned how to forgive. He couldn't change the past, but he could live for the present and the future. He had made a decision: he would no longer let the pain control his life. He would help his mother build a new future, one without cruelty and lies. And then, on a spring afternoon, Frank and Julia stood together at their front door. They looked at each other, and Julia once again said, "Thank you, for bringing me home, for giving me the chance to live again." Frank hugged his mother tightly, his eyes brimming with tears. "You'll never have to be afraid again. You'll always have me by your side." That day, Frank realized something important: life might never be perfect, but love and forgiveness could bring hope and healing. He and his mother would continue walking down the path ahead: no more pain, no more fear, only love and happiness. Their life would never return to what it had once been, but at least they had found each other again. And that was the most important thing. In Frank's eyes, his mother was no longer the woman trapped in the darkness of the past. She was a strong woman, one who had overcome everything to find happiness and peace again. And Frank, her son, would always be her protector and the one who loved her most. As time passed, Frank and Julia's life gradually settled. Though the dark past still lingered in their minds, they found a way to rise above it, to rebuild their lives from broken pieces. Frank no longer felt anger toward his father, not in the way he once did. He had learned how to forgive, not only his father but also himself. He knew that if he continued living in anger and hatred, he would never be able to help his mother find peace. His mother, Julia, slowly rediscovered the joys of life. Although there were still moments of fear and panic, and the nightmares of the past often haunted her, she grew stronger with each passing day. She took part in social activities, helping women in difficult situations, women who had suffered like she once had. What she had gone through turned her into a resilient, compassionate woman with a generous heart. Frank couldn't help but feel proud of his mother. He witnessed her incredible transformation, from a woman imprisoned by fear to someone who now inspired others. Julia no longer lived in the silence of the past. She shared her story, encouraging other women to stand up and reclaim their power over their own lives. One day, while walking with his mother in the park, Frank realized that he had found peace within himself. The years of suffering, the endless nights without his mother by his side, had now become distant memories. He had found his mother again, and more importantly, he had helped her find herself. He felt as though his life had returned to its rightful path. "Did you ever think you'd be able to come back from all of this?" Frank asked as they sat together on a bench in the park, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. Julia was quiet for a moment, then gently replied, "I don't know. Back then, I didn't have any hope left. I had accepted that I would never find you again. But now, with you here, I realize life can still hold happiness. We can start over." Frank felt a lump in his throat hearing those words. He knew how much pain his mother had endured, and now, she was finally able to open her heart to a new life. Julia's words were confirmation that love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds of the soul. He looked at his mother, his eyes full of tears. "I'll always be here, Mom. You'll never have to be afraid again." The two of them sat there, beneath the gentle sunset, saying nothing more. All they needed was each other's presence. Frank knew that no matter how life changed, they would always have each other. And that was what mattered most. They had found what was lost, and even more, they had found peace in their hearts. Day by day, Frank and Julia continued to live side by side, helping others and building a life full of love. Julia became a strong woman, an inspiration to those around her. She joined charity organizations, helped women who had suffered from abuse, and shared her story so they, too, could find their strength again. She always reminded everyone that no matter how hard life got, they could find the light if they stood up and fought for it. Frank also shared his mother's story with his friends and those around him. He knew that by telling the truth, he could help people understand that in this life, nothing was impossible to overcome if there was love and forgiveness. He also learned to forgive himself because he knew that although the past had been painful, he could still create a bright future for himself and for his mother. One autumn morning, as golden leaves fell all over the road in front of their home, Frank and Julia stood together, watching the leaves drift in the breeze. Frank looked at his mother, his eyes full of gratitude and love. "I've learned so much from you," he said quietly. "You taught me that no matter how difficult life gets, love and forgiveness are the most important things." Julia turned to look at her son and smiled. "All I've ever wanted is for you to be happy. And you know what? You are the greatest gift life has ever given me." Frank felt his heart grow lighter. The years of suffering were behind them, and now he had his mother back. He no longer felt alone. He had his mother, and that was all he needed. They had overcome every challenge, and now they could begin a new life, a life full of love and peace. Life wasn't always easy, but love and forgiveness could bring healing. Frank and Julia had learned that. And from then on, they continued walking forward, with no more pain, only love and happiness. Frank sat in the quiet room, staring out the window where the morning light streamed through the lush green branches of the trees. His heart was full of anticipation, but also heavy with worry. His mother had gradually stabilized, but the painful memories of the past had yet to fade. Frank knew that the truth about his father remained an unhealed wound in her heart. He had helped his mother find peace, but would his father's punishment for his crimes bring true liberation for them all? In the days that had passed, Frank had done everything he could to support his mother, from finding the best treatment facilities to ensuring she no longer had to suffer fear and loneliness. He helped her rediscover joy in simple things like walking through the park, visiting new places, and attending support groups for women who had been through hardship. But deep inside, the question of his father's punishment still haunted him. Richard could not be allowed to escape responsibility for what he had done. That day, Frank decided to continue the legal battle. He knew his father had been arrested and would have to stand trial for the charge of unlawful deprivation of liberty, but it still wasn't enough. He wanted to do everything possible to make sure his father paid a price worthy of his crimes, so his mother would never have to suffer again. He contacted his lawyer, Alexander, who had helped him gather evidence and reopen the case. They worked late into the night, preparing for the next steps. "We can't stop here," Frank said, his voice firm with determination. "This won't be over until my father pays in full. He didn't just take my mother's freedom, he stole my entire childhood. I won't let him escape the truth." Alexander nodded in agreement with Frank's decision. "We'll bring him into the light," Alexander replied. "The evidence clearly shows he abused his power to strip his wife of her freedom. He will have to answer for it." Frank's plan was to bring the case to a public trial, ensuring media involvement so everyone would know the truth about his father's cruelty. He was determined not only to seek justice for his mother but also to put an end to society's tendency to protect the powerful. He wanted people to understand that no one is above the law, no matter who they are. In the weeks that followed, everything moved at a dizzying pace. The press began covering Richard's case, and public attention slowly shifted from admiration to outrage. Criticism from the public and social activists destroyed what remained of his father's reputation. Meanwhile, Frank relentlessly pursued the lawsuit, working with witnesses, gathering more evidence, and ensuring every detail was in place. The day of the final trial arrived. Frank stood in the courthouse hallway, anxiety churning inside him. His mother, although stable, still felt afraid at the thought of facing the past. But today, she had decided to come to court, to see her husband held accountable for his actions. She wanted to reclaim the freedom that had been stolen from her for the past 30 years. "I'll be right here with you, Mom," Frank said as they walked into the courtroom. His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and worry, but there was also a faint light of hope shining through. As Frank and his mother entered the courtroom, every eye turned toward them. Richard, the man Frank had once respected, sat there with no sign of remorse on his face. He remained cold and indifferent, as if none of it mattered to him. Frank could barely stand the sight of his father. The years of living under his oppression, the lies he had told Frank, all came flooding back. Frank stepped forward, facing his father, his eyes burning with fury. "Father," Frank said, his voice low and seething with anger. "My mother suffered your cruelty for 30 years. You stole her freedom. You made her live in fear. You're not worthy of being my father, and today, you will answer for everything you've done." Richard looked at his son, his expression unchanged. "I did what was best for this family. I protected us from her weakness," he said, his voice still cold and detached. But this time, Frank did not lower his head. He looked straight into his father's eyes and spoke, his voice full of determination. "No, Father. You didn't protect this family. You destroyed it. And now, you will have to face the truth." Frank's mother stood beside him, her eyes brimming with tears, but she also felt a sense of relief. Things had gone too far, but at least she could now see justice beginning to be served. After so many years of living in fear and torment, today she was able to stand alongside her son and speak the truth. The trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom growing more tense with each passing minute. Although Frank had prepared himself thoroughly, facing his father still made it impossible to hide the anger and fury that surged inside him. Every word out of Richard's mouth, the man he had once admired, was another dagger to his heart. The coldness, the complete lack of remorse from that man, filled Frank with even more disgust. His mother, Julia, sat quietly beside him, but Frank could feel the tension in each of her breaths. She had suffered too much over the past 30 years, and no matter how Richard tried to justify or defend himself, she could never forgive what he had done. Julia felt as if she had just come through a nightmare, but she was no longer afraid. She had her son beside her, and this time, she would not let Frank's father's crimes remain in the dark. "Father," Frank said again, his voice strong and resolute. "I've heard what you have to say, and I can no longer accept it. You didn't just steal my mother's freedom, you stole her life. You're not only cruel, but you're completely without conscience." Richard didn't respond immediately. He sat in silence, staring at his son, his eyes cold and arrogant. After a moment, he finally spoke. "You don't understand, Frank. Your mother was too weak. She wasn't worthy of me, and I did everything I could to protect this family." His voice rang out as if it were some twisted self-justification, but Frank could no longer bear it. "I understand enough, Father," Frank shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You are the one who destroyed this family. You made my mother live in unimaginable conditions, and I, your son, was forced to grow up without her for all those years. I will not let you escape responsibility for what you've done." The room fell silent. Everyone's attention was fixed on the confrontation between father and son. Julia, sitting beside Frank, could only grip his hand tightly. Though she said nothing, in her heart, every word Frank spoke was the truth. Every pain, every torment she had endured over the past 30 years, was now being brought into the light. The trial continued with witness testimonies and lawyers presenting clear evidence of Richard's unlawful imprisonment of Julia. Documents proving he had committed her to the mental institution, along with medical records showing she was never mentally ill but instead held there illegally, left Richard with no ground for defense. Frank's lawyer had done an excellent job, delivering sharp arguments that made everyone present in the courtroom fully grasp the truth. Despite how completely the case had turned against Richard, he still showed no remorse. He continued to justify his cruel actions, without a trace of regret. This only strengthened Frank's determination. He would not let his father avoid punishment. He knew the price his father had to pay was inevitable, and nothing could change that. As the court continued reviewing the evidence and deliberated on the verdict, Frank sat beside his mother, feeling his heart pounding harder than ever before. He looked at Julia, his mother, the woman he once thought he had lost forever. But now, she was sitting next to him, free, no longer afraid. Tears fell from his eyes, but this time, they were tears of release and happiness. He knew the waiting was finally over. At last, the court's verdict was announced. Richard was found guilty of unlawful deprivation of liberty and of cruel treatment toward his wife over the past 30 years. Faced with the truth, even without remorse, the court's acknowledgement of his crimes forced him to pay for what he had done. Though he continued to hold on to his arrogance, in the end, his power was stripped away, and his punishment had begun. Frank stood up, his eyes full of determination and strength. He turned to look at his mother, and in her eyes was a peacefulness, as if everything they had endured had suddenly become part of the past. His mother had come back to life, and his father, though nothing could ever undo what he had done, had finally paid for his crimes. "We've won, Mom," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "At last, justice has been served. And Father is no longer the powerful man we once knew. He's paid the price." Julia looked at her son, her eyes filled with love. "My son," she said softly, "I'm not afraid anymore. I have you beside me, and we're going to start a new life." After the trial ended, the tension still lingered in the courtroom air. But Frank and Julia walked out with steps steadier than ever before. They didn't need to say anything more. Although his father had faced justice and the sentence had been passed, for both of them, a new chapter of life had begun. There was no more fear, no more nightmares of a past filled with suffering. Frank glanced at his mother. The worrying tension that had once clouded her eyes were gone. She smiled at him, as if all the pain had drifted away. But Frank knew that, despite the conclusion of the trial and the justice that had been served, the wounds in her soul would not heal overnight. What mattered was that she no longer lived in fear. His mother could now live a new life, one not controlled by the darkness of the past. They walked out of the courthouse slowly but confidently. The people around them watched with admiration in their eyes. Reporters and others who had followed the case couldn't take their eyes off Frank and Julia. They had endured immense pain, but today, they were victors. Not just victors in a courtroom, but victors in life. They had reclaimed their freedom and justice. "How do you feel?" Julia asked, looking at her son with pride. Frank turned to his mother and smiled. "I feel like I can finally breathe again, Mom. We lived under that weight for so long. But now, it's finally over. He paid for everything he did." Julia nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "I know, my son. I no longer have to live in the dark. You brought me back to life, and I will never forget that." All Frank could do in that moment was hold his mother tightly, letting her know that he would always be there and never let her be alone again. He understood that, although justice had been served, no punishment could ever bring back what they had lost. They could only move forward, building a new life, one filled with love and happiness. Frank and his mother began a new chapter in their lives. After the trial, they moved into a new apartment, a place where there was no trace of fear or guilt. It was more than a home, it was a place of peace. Julia began to start over, enrolling in art and creative classes, things she had always dreamed of doing but had never been able to because of the chains of her past. Frank, supported by his friends and colleagues, also worked hard to rebuild his own life. Gradually, Julia realized that growing older didn't mean living in loneliness or sorrow. She began to make new friends, strong and independent women she met in her classes. Their stories, their struggles, and the challenges they had overcome made Julia feel she was not alone in her journey. She realized that, despite all the unspeakable pain she had endured, she could still create a new life for herself, one filled with joy and meaning. Frank, too, never stopped striving in his work. He found joy in helping others, sharing his mother's story with anyone who needed encouragement. He started a community project to support abused women, women like his mother once was, helping them overcome fear and reclaim their freedom. The project not only allowed him to help others but also became a part of his own healing, slowly mending the wounds in his soul. In the months that followed, Frank and Julia became a source of inspiration for the community around them. They participated in charitable activities, organized events, and shared their stories of recovery, forgiveness, and rebirth. Every step they took was a reminder that, no matter how terrible life could be, love and perseverance could help overcome any challenge. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Julia held Frank's hand and said, "You know, you're the reason I found life again. I'm no longer afraid. I know that no matter what happens, I will always have you by my side." Frank felt the love in his mother's words. He smiled, took a deep breath, and replied, "We've made it through everything, Mom. And from now on, we'll never let the past stand in the way of our future." With those words, Frank and his mother began to step into a new life, a life full of hope and love. They no longer lived in the shadows of the past, no longer haunted by Richard and everything he had done. This life, though not perfect, was theirs, and they would rebuild it from what they now had. The lesson from their story is that forgiveness and justice can always bring healing and restoration. No matter how terrible the past may be, resilience and love can help us overcome every challenge. Through Frank and Julia's journey, we learn that truth, though painful, will ultimately lead to freedom. Justice not only heals wounds but also gives those who have suffered the strength to rebuild their lives and rediscover joy in their new beginnings.